Thank you so much, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. As I was introduced, my name is Cate Mingoya, and I'm the Director of Capacity Building at Groundworks USA. And Groundworks USA serves as the capacity building organization for a network of 21 independent, people-centered environmental justice nonprofits. I highly encourage you to hop online, go see if there's a Groundwork Trust in your area, and get involved. It's pretty cool. We do some pretty cool stuff. Generally, our work is related to urban revitalization and community revitalization. So we often take brownfield or contaminated parcels and transform them with the community into assets that benefit that same community, things like trails and parks and urban farms. We're often the urban forester in the communities that we work in. We run a lot of youth training programs, but more recently we've been moving into the climate mitigation space, both thinking about what needs to happen at a policy level to make sure that resources are more equitably distributed, and how do we make sure that residents in these communities that are suffering from the effects of the climate crisis are safer from extreme heat and extreme precipitation. Because we all know that it's getting pretty wet, it's getting pretty hot in here. The National Climate Assessment estimates that there's going to be hundreds of billions of dollars a year in lost labor productivity and mortality, and we know that the consequences of this change in climate are not being felt equally. They're not being felt equally from state to state. They're not being felt equally from city to city, and they're not even being felt equally within the same city and in between neighborhoods. And I'm here to tell you today that that's not a coincidence. We were lucky enough to get to ask this question, and you may have seen Vivek Chandas's and Jeremy Hoffman's work that looks at this at a national level, but we were able to ask, related to our Groundwork Trust, is there a relationship between historical redlining practices, and if you don't know what that is, I'm going to catch you up, and then modern day risk to extreme heat and precipitation. So we started with 5 cities, but we've since expanded our partnerships from coast to coast in places where we have Groundwork Trust, so everywhere from Richmond, Virginia to Richmond, California, and in between. To do this Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership. I'm going to talk about the partnership in a second, but in case you're not familiar with redlining or maybe you're a little bit rusty, I'm going to catch you up in like 30 seconds. So we're all going to travel back in time together. It is the Great Depression. People are suffering, and the federal government is searching for New Deal programs to help increase the income of residents and help to build wealth and the economic capacity of Americans. And we know that one of the ways that is the easiest and the most consistent within our communities, if you're able to get a hold of a piece of property, that is one way to build intergenerational wealth. So the federal government wanted to make this easier for folks. If you are currently a homeowner, you probably still benefit from this program today in the 2020s, this idea of these federally backed mortgages. The idea behind the federally backed mortgages is that you can get debt to buy a home or to buy a piece of property from a private lender, and if you default, the government's going to pick up the tab. It loosens up that money so that folks can invest and can own their homes and buy property. But when this program was being rolled out, the federal government wanted to figure out what places were going to be a risky place to back those mortgages and which places were going to be safe places to back those mortgages. So they developed the Homeowners Loan Corporation, who went to many cities across the United States. Check out Mapping Inequality. You can look at your neighborhood and see what they said about your neighborhood. And that Homeowners Loan Corporation figured out which places were considered risky bets. Those places tended to be places where Black residents live, that had lower quality housing stock, that were lower income, and they outlined them in red, like in this map of Brooklyn, that's redlined. And then neighborhoods that were wealthier, that were white, that had a high quality housing stock, those neighborhoods were outlined and shaded in green. And you might say, okay, Cate, so what does shading a couple colors in on a map in 1930 have to do with today, have to do with the climate crisis, have to do with who has access to intergenerational wealth? Well, if you were one of those people of color who were living in that redlined neighborhood, you had a problem. If you owned your property, other people could not get debt to buy, you could not get federally backed debt to buy that property from you, so you couldn't sell. If you were someone who lived in that redlined area and you wanted to buy a property to live in or to improve your family's access to intergenerational wealth, you were out of luck too, because that federally backed debt was not given in those neighborhoods. But what if you were a person of color and you wanted to move out to, say, one of those green lined neighborhoods with a nice quality housing stock and different amenities? Well, you weren't allowed there either, because of the lenders are not going to lend you money to live in that space because they don't want to reduce the property values and they don't want to turn that area into a red-lined neighborhood. And then people like the realtors and the sellers and the neighbors are also going to exclude from that community. So we see a lot of the same impacts of of redlining and of segregation. We're going to talk a little bit about how we still see those impacts today. And we saw a large amount of financial disinvestment in those neighborhoods between the 1930s into the present. Sewage systems not being updated. Those neighborhoods are often ones that are prone to flooding or extreme heat. The placement of parks or trees was not done as robustly in these redlined neighborhoods as they were in other neighborhoods. And I just want to be very clear that redlining did not start this. Redlining just codified a history of segregation practices that were done at the municipal level for a very, very long time. So I'm going to show you a series of images of Union County, New Jersey, which is where Elizabeth, New Jersey is, just south of New York City. You might be familiar with New York Airport. And just as a reminder, green, first grade, white residents, good housing stock. D, usually black and brown people, poor quality housing stock, not allowed to have mortgages. Yes.
Cate, sorry, people are having trouble with the audio, and so if possible, could people just call in to the phone line if they're having trouble with the quality of the audio from the computer. Sarah just posted the number on in chat, and if you could just slow down a little bit, just because the audio is not that good, so people are having trouble hearing.
Okay, thank you so much. So this image, Union County, New Jersey, just south of New York City. I want you to keep your eye on any red square. These colored images are the digitization of redlining maps for Union County, New Jersey. So keep your eye on any red square. This shows tree canopy cover. This shows impermeable pavement, so think driveways and parking lots. And then this shows land surface temperature. I'm going to show you now the same series of images, but I want you to keep your eye on a green parcel. So again, these are the redlining images overlaid on top of Union County. This is tree canopy cover, impermeable pavement, and there's land surface temperature again. So you might say, hey, I think that there's something going on here, but I'm not entirely sure. The eye test isn't really working for me. Well, this graph shows the punchline pretty well. In the climate-safe neighborhood cities that we've worked in, as you go from left to right on this image, so from A to D, you see that, so remember, A is green lined and D is red lined. You see that red bar go up, that's land surface temperature. You see that impermeable pavement bar, that gray one, go up. And then you see that green bar, which is tree canopy cover, go down really precipitously. So that's the punchline. And you might say, well, what are the implications of that? How did we get here today? What does this still have to do with race? Well, today about 75% of those neighborhoods that were degraded in the 1930s are still low to moderate income communities. And about 64% of those degraded areas are still majority and minority neighborhoods. So the impacts of racial segregation, historical segregation practices in housing that we experienced in the 1930s still have a really big impact on who lives there today. And who lives there today in a lot of these redlined neighborhoods that are experiencing extreme heat and extreme precipitation are low-income folks and are people of color. Now, if you've been around the block and you've studied racial justice issues and been paying attention to any of the conversations happening over the last 10, 15, 20 years about social determinants of health or about our cities, at this point you're probably disappointed but not surprised. I'm not going to leave you hanging. A little bit later in the presentation, I'm going to tell you what we at the Groundwork Trust are doing about this. But in the meantime, I'm going to pass this off to Vivek, who's going to fill in some of the gaps for you and talk to you a little bit about the science and the data and the research of his work. So that's a lot of data and a lot of information, and one of the things that we wanted to do in the Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership is figure out what's the so what. So we understand where the problems are, we understand the scope and the scale, we understand the historical connection. How do we prioritize neighborhoods for intervention, and how do we get folks on board to get a more equitable distribution of resources in their community? So the way that we prioritize neighborhoods in the Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership was to look at a couple of metrics, one of which is the Heat Vulnerability Index, which basically says what are the places that have a relatively high land surface temperature, so that are relatively hot compared to other neighborhoods in the same city, and what areas also have the least adaptive capacity to deal with it. I am calling you now from Boston, and it is really, really hot here. And if you are a family that does not have a lot of expendable resources, these air conditioning bills are going to be really challenging and difficult for you. So we identified neighborhoods in each one of the cities that had a high relative land surface temperature, had high flood risk, and in both cases had a low adaptive capacity of residents. And Our big goals are to organize stakeholders, to pull a broad coalition of people together. And one of my favorites is from Elizabeth, New Jersey, where they pull together everyone from the boys basketball teams, the local yeshiva, to the maintenance workers of the Elizabeth Housing Authority, to pull them together and learn about why our communities look like this. Our communities don't look like this by accident, and they're not going to change by accident. There's a really deep intentionality to the reasons why our neighborhoods look the way that they do. So we need to recognize that, and we need to have explicit conversations about that. The next piece is working with residents to understand and prioritize the mitigation measures that they would like to see in their neighborhood and in their communities. Residents need to be in the driver's seat. Residents need to be the ones that are making decisions about what happens to the built environment. And so often they're not even allowed into the conversation. They need to drive the car, but they're not even allowed in the car. And our hope is to build the capacity of residents to intervene in policy and planning processes like master planning processes and budgetary cycles so that they can self-advocate for a more equitable distribution of resources. And that might be the planting of trees, that might be cisterns, that might be bioswales, that might be more open and green space, that might be community education or just clearing sewers to help their neighborhood flood a little bit less. And one of the things that's so important is to make sure that the mitigation measures that actually do come up to the table and that are implemented are culturally complementary and that they're community driven. In one of the trust communities that we've worked in, the city had a parcel of land that they didn't quite know what to do with, but they knew that local residents loved to play soccer. They'd see them doing it on smaller parcels of land or on side streets. So without really talking to the community, they raised over this large bed of land and built a large soccer pitch. But when folks spoke to residents and the abutters on this soccer pitch, people really wanted a space where they could have birthday parties or where they could lounge and read a book or where they could exercise and go for walks and meet with their community members. So it's really important to pay attention not just to the idea of we need trees or we need a green space, but we need something that's culturally complementary to the people who are living there, because if it's not, they're not going to use it and it's not going to do much good. One example of the work that we're doing in the Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership is out of Denver. A couple of years ago, Denver passed Ballot 2A, which provides a steady funding stream for capital maintenance projects and for capital backlog and for the development of new green spaces. And that money is given out on a 5-year cycle. And Denver has a very long relationship with Globeville, which is a neighborhood that has a very long history of environmental injustice. There used to be a lead smelting plant there. And they worked very closely with the residents to look at that tree canopy data. And they found that where they were sitting in Globeville, the tree canopy cover was about 1%. But if you were to just take along a single bus line across the river, you would be in a neighborhood that was formerly green lined where the tree canopy was 24%. So taking a look at this data and going over it with residents allowed them to come up with a really concrete ask. And the ask is for 10,000 trees to be planted in 10 years, and for the planting of the trees, but also the long-term maintenance and community education to be funded through that Ballot 2A cycle. Richmond, Virginia is another example that we're working with, where we've prioritized neighborhoods that have a very high heat vulnerability index. And in the Richmond master planning process, we were able to pull together residents to review that plan and to give feedback about the specific neighborhoods and the specific corners where they would like to see their commute times become a little bit cooler, or areas where they like to gather and congregate become a little bit cooler. And in the latest draft plan of the Richmond 300 planning process, the city has agreed to prioritize neighborhoods with a high heat vulnerability index for future funding for green infrastructure and greenscaping. All of our trusts were thrown, just like the rest of the world, a winter curveball. And a lot of the residents that we're working with face this triple threat: climate crisis, which we know is coming and we've been dealing with for a long time and we're going to deal with for a long time, COVID-19, and of course the faltering or stumbling economy that comes from COVID-19. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of those community members that we work with who are living in formerly red-line neighborhoods, who are living in places that are hotter and wetter than in other places within the same city, that those places are also disproportionately impacted by COVID and are also disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. All of these are connected, all of these are related to one another, and we need to approach them together. We're still seeing that same, so if you're somebody who's living in, for example, Richmond, California, which is this image, there's a section of Richmond, California that's outlined there called the Black Crescent. And while there were never redlining maps produced for Richmond, California, you can go back into the historical archives and see that the federal government did intentionally segregate Black residents who'd moved there during the war period to work in the shipyards and in the refinery, and segregated them between the refinery and between the rail yards in this area called the Black Crescent in the Iron Triangle. The brown that you see overlaid are asthma rates. So if you're someone who is living in a neighborhood that is formerly racially segregated, that's between a rail yard, that's currently next to a refinery, and that has really high asthma rates, you're probably going to be more vulnerable to the impacts of COVID-19. So we see these connections and we see these overlaps in all these different directions. Additionally, summer's here. It's really hot, and the work that Jeremy Hoffman and Vivek developed showed that on average there's about a 4.5 degree Fahrenheit difference between neighborhoods within the same city that have been redlined or not, but that can be as high as 16 degrees Fahrenheit. And I want you to imagine what that actually feels like. That's the difference between being able to sleep at night and not because you're too hot. That's the difference between a $100 air conditioning bill and a $300 air conditioning bill, at the end of the month. It might be the difference between you having a really relaxing and joyful summer and you ending up in the hospital for something like heat stroke or a pulmonary issue. And a lot of the solutions that we bring to the table, like trees, this is a tree that's planted outside my apartment in Boston, they're kind of spindly and they're not super useful immediately, or they're not as useful as they will be. So the solutions that we're coming up with, these short-term mitigation measures, are only a piece of that pie. And generally, our summer toolbox is looking a little bit anemic. If you're really hot and in the city, not all parents are comfortable letting their kids go to splash pads, or maybe your splash pad is still closed. Do we really want to put our seniors and our low-income residents of need into cooling centers where they might be more vulnerable to COVID? And of course, we know that keeping cool is really expensive. This is my July 2019 energy bill from a particularly hot Boston summer. So at this point, you might feel, hey, Cate, I'm a little bit sad. There are a lot of crises. There's a lot of overlapping issues that people in our country are doing. What can we do about it? Well, it's really funny that I believe that grassroots efforts can meet this community need. But it's very important to set expectations that there's no one panacea. It's instead going to be a bunch of 1% solutions that are hopefully going to add up to 100%. And trees are a component of this, but they're not the end of the story. But one of the things that we're focusing on, in addition to the capacity building of residents to intervene in planning processes and in budgetary cycles, is also for them to implement short-term grassroots mitigation measures. And that means going door to door, having conversations with people in line at the supermarket, talking to people about what they need in order to help them get through this summer and in order to help them get through the impacts of the climate crisis. So these are things like AC swaps, businesses that maybe are closed and are going to continue to have their doors closed. We're delivering some of those air conditioning units to residents who are at risk, and loading sprinklers out so that families can have a splash pad in their backyards or out in front of their homes. White roof painting to help reduce the cooling costs of buildings, and even things like thinking about what does a person's day-to-day life look like, and creating opportunities to get relief from the heat in that day-to-day life. So for example, bus shelters. If you're getting up in your unair-conditioned apartment and you're going to walk through the hot streets to wait for a bus for 20 minutes, it's going to be really difficult to do that comfortably if the sun is blazing and you don't have a bus shelter. So building cooler and green bus shelters. And then one of my favorite, which is defacing, getting rid of pavement when it doesn't necessarily need to be there. So ripping up folks' backyards and overlaying it with green space. So in the long term, it's really important that we invest in communities and make sure that not only are they allowed in the car, but that they are in the driver's seat of policy that's going to help dictate changes in urban form and access to green infrastructure and access to mechanisms that are going to help people get through the climate crisis, get through COVID-19, get through the economic crisis that's going along with that. So I encourage you folks to hop on our website, groundworkusa.org. We've got more information about the initiative in each one of our 9 cities, and I encourage you folks to check out the maps, and especially if you live in one of those cities, and see what we're up to, see what the impact has been. And thanks so much for joining us.